Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Today I am joined by Cool Apple 29. Sorry, I was trying to read that as I was doing the introduction. John, where can people find you if they want to see where you stand on things and where you promote your ideas?
Just on Twitter. I basically an anonymous Twitter account, so nothing crazy.
The other day, a lot of people made quite a bit out of Vivek Ramaswamy's tweet. There were a number of things that are in here. Let's go through this briefly. And after each paragraph, I'll stop and you can let me know if you agree or disagree. Let's go right here. The reason top tech companies often hire foreign born and first generation engineers over native Americans isn't because of an innate American IQ deficit, a lazy and wrong explanation. A key part of it comes down to the C word, culture. Tough questions demand tough answers, and if we're really serious about fixing the problem, we have to confront the truth. What do you think about this opening statement?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, wages definitely is going to play a factor. They are looking for cheap labor. I have worked in tech actually. I worked not directly. I was in a like a middle management for a big tech company for around 2.5 years, three. Even lived in the Bay Area for like a year and a half, 2 years. So he's partially right in a way. Um, they aren't. Sometimes it does require longer hours, and that is something that I did notice. Um, that some workers from India they had no problem doing, but it is a wage factor as well. Um, they are going to work for less. Obviously, they're going to want it. But yeah, I
Absolutely.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's
He
like
says, our American culture has venerated mediocrity over excellence for way too long, at least since the 90s and likely longer. That doesn't start in college, it starts young. Do you think American culture has venerated mediocrity over excellence?
no, I mean it pushes hard work. I mean, it's definitely a grind, but yeah, I would disagree with that. I would say it's more of a victim culture. I don't think that plays into working hard. Would be,
Okay, because I do feel like I don't know where I would get statistics on this, but it seems like I was in college about 8 years ago,
okay.
and it seems like there were very, very low standards for what people were expected to actually achieve. Big accomplishments would be things like changing your pronouns or declaring that you're going to have like a very narrowly focused major. It didn't seem like people were really striving for excellence. It was much more about people are always entitled to respect, and excellence is kind of promoting bourgeois inequality culture. So I saw a lot of it when I was younger, where people didn't really care about merit. Everyone basically deserved the same thing, and excellence was kind of you insulting everyone else in your group. Did you see that at all when you were I'm 28 now, and this was probably ages 16 to 25.
Okay. I actually went to college later because I was in the service. No, I mean, I would definitely say that. I would say they made the standards basically anyone. I would say the bottom could meet it. I mean, I knew a girl. She in one of the math classes, she got a book with essentially the answers because she said she had a learning disability, but um, it was nothing that would show that she, was different or anything. But there's people getting bachelors that, were given extra time on tests. So that always kind of blew my mind. And it was a decent state school I went to. So,
I did notice at Arizona State University, there were maybe 15% of the students were East Asian, and the library at any given moment was maybe 95% Asian. I think it definitely has to do with the culture that people embrace that it totally explain why Asians have higher incomes than whites and why whites have higher incomes than blacks. Do you think the main thing we're seeing is a cultural divide that can sometimes be seen through the lens of race, or is something like nation what we should focus on as opposed to culture?
I mean, it could be a mix of both. I mean, obviously, you look at statistics, obviously, different nations outperform the others, and we do get a good amount of the top performers from each country. I believed it was like Nigerians were one of the most educated groups coming to the U.S. But I do think Asians, that we heard the term "tiger moms." I could definitely see that. I know many Indian families. I know I don't have statistics, but it seems like the goal is. I mean, college isn't even a question; they're expected to go. So that's
Oh,
something I
yeah,
can believe.
as well as Jewish families too.
Oh,
Um,
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was one more. Okay. I wanted to say that I get that there's a selection process. People don't randomly come from Japan, South Korea, and China to America. Only the most ambitious ones, those people tend to be more ambitious. The point is that this completely refutes the progressive narrative that all differences in incomes between the races are as a result of white supremacy. The fact that whites, I think, are like 12th on median income after Japanese
Yes. I
Americans, Taiwanese Americans, Indian Americans. That is such a poisonous, divisive thing that colleges have been pushing. Whereas it's so empowering to realize that this is fake because you realize you can actually do things to change the way your life is. You have a lot of control. You can show up to work on time. The main reason people got fired at my last few jobs was attendance, something that's almost totally within your control. You can ask for on the job training. You can look at people you admire and see what skills they have and try to emulate them. You can get a mentor. There's a reason only a small percentage of people get paid the minimum wage because employers are competing for their
right.
skills. So I just hate this. The system's against you, so don't bother working hard. Don't bother showing up on time. The system's still going to screw you over. Anything else on this cultural aspect of Ramaswamy's tweet before we move on?
No, I mean, I didn't. I do see where he's coming from. Uh, I do think he's kind of doing a sleight of hand with he's leaving out a part about wages. I do agree with him culturally. They are looking for people that match what he was saying. So,
I agree. All right. You have a picture of Pat Buchanan in your Twitter bio. And this made me say, well, this gentleman and I have to have a lot of overlap on something. This started after John and I got into a respectable disagreement on Twitter. I wanted to have him on so we can lead by example and show that productive conversations can happen, even when tensions get a little high on X. I keep calling it Twitter. What are the great lessons you have learned from Pat Buchanan? This was Richard Nixon's speechwriter and later presidential candidate.
one of the great lessons, my it was where the right went wrong. Basically, talked about the rise of the neocons from the party. I grew up during the W era where, I always kind of thought knew history. I knew a little bit about Reagan and all that. I was younger, but it was always thought that Republicans were the hawks, that, they were always kind of neoconish. Just him breaking down the history of the party and kind of like how it went, Nixon, Vietnam, basically it kind of did open my eyes. It was a different way of thinking. We got to see the failure of Iraq and Afghanistan. The I think the Ukraine war. Obviously, Russia is uh, at fault for it overall, but I mean, they were. H.W. Bush talked about pushing the borders or the dangers of it. And if he said that today, I mean, he would be called a Russian asset. And so probably his probably is just foreign policy. I also agreed with you'll probably disagree as a libertarian, but he did mention a lot of corporations. They kind of their loyalty to the U.S. compared to past, you know, isn't really on the same level. So to the U.S. So, but those this foreign policy really was special to me. So
I was really surprised to see a Republican presidential candidate said the US should not have entered the Second World War or the First World War. He makes a very good case in A Republic, Not an Empire. And he was opposed to the first Iraq War in 1991. Him and Joe Soberin, along with my colleague at the Libertarian Institute, Sheldon Richman, got together and I forget what they had called it. It was like Committee to Avoid a Holocaust or something. It was something very provocative like that, where they said, look, we just won. There was this terrible Cold War. We were on pins and needles for decades, worrying there'd be a nuclear exchange. We won. The last thing we need to do is go finding enemies like Saddam Hussein, let alone provoking NATO. In Buchanan's 1999 book, um, A Republic, Not an Empire, one of the first sections is titled Quartering Conflict with Russia. And
I've seen that. Yeah,
he warns against NATO expansion, especially to Georgia and Ukraine, the two countries Bush Jr. said would come into NATO as he was leaving office in 2008. Buchanan was just so brilliant on being able to see where this stuff led to. I also really appreciated how he mentioned empires that spread themselves too thin end up going away, end up vanishing. So if you're pro America, it doesn't necessarily follow that you want to provoke conflicts because this could weaken your nation. As the examples he uses is Tsarist Russia overexpanded in the First World War and couldn't defend their own capital in Moscow, and the Bolsheviks were able to take over. The Ottoman Empire overexpanded in the First World War, and they came crumbling down. Kaiser Wilhelm's empire overexpanded with a war on two fronts. The Japanese empire he uses, not to mention the Soviet empire overexpanded. So there are just so many great lessons from Pat Buchanan. Anything else on him before we get into the new Cold War?
uh, no, not really. I mean, you touched all bases. I mean, it is interesting to see his legacy once he passed. I mean, I know in the '90s he was kind of forced out by the National Review. But I am curious how this new generation, especially with Trump winning, is going to treat him. So
And did you
after his time,
support President Trump in the last election?
yes, I vote for Trump. Yeah,
And what were your main reasons for doing so?
just his policies. I know he kind of backtracked on abortion, but just overall, he talks about protectionism and tariffs. He's still capitalist. Harris, even though she did try to track to the center, she's anytime you have a Democrat in, you are going to backslide into statism. So those would be my reasons.
Yeah, my whole
Just
thing
overall,
was yeah, his willingness to negotiate with both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. I thought that was so important when all he said was basically the dying needs to stop in the Russia Ukraine conflict, which is not some brilliant contribution intellectually, but it was a hell of a lot more than we were getting from Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris.
no, definitely his no wars. That's always been a major selling point. Sending troops to like eastern Ukraine would be insane. So, which is
When
something
were
that Liz Cheney.
oh yeah. When were you in the military?
I had a break in service. So I was in 2010 through 2014.
So the things that come to mind in that era, well, 2014, there was the Maidan revolution. Was there any discussions in the military about what was happening in Ukraine in 2014, like amongst you
No,
guys?
no, that wasn't really. It was just another. I mean, you don't really pay too much attention to international news. but it was just like another third world country having conflict. So not conflict,
The
but changing government.
So in 2011, there was the NATO operation in Libya. Do you have any information on that?
And no, I mean there was no like troops on the ground or anything. One of the I think submarines launched Tomahawks, but I'm not too familiar with what took place. I think it was mostly an air war.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, there is no like boots on the ground as far as I know. Maybe evacuating people, but yeah, I mean it was just Libya was the bad guy. Uh, I didn't really know too much. I knew about Libya. I knew about Gaddafi. Still kind of neoconish, but yeah, we didn't. I think they just didn't know what to do after it fell. They kind of just thought it would sort itself out.
Yeah, Obama even makes that clear in his book, A Promised Land. He said, "We took out Gaddafi's regime at a lower cost than we were spending in Iraq and Afghanistan on a daily basis. Unfortunately, due to a lack of historic democratic institutions in Libya, it created somewhat of a power vacuum." So that was just shocking to read. And then the other thing in that time frame, um, Obama came out and said, Bashar al Assad is using chemical weapons and Assad needs to go, was his headline. My understanding is that with Operation Timber Sycamore, they ended up siding with Al Qaeda in Syria to overthrow Assad. Is this accurate?
I don't. I had friends in Syria. I never went myself. Um, I don't know. I know some that aren't. I don't know. I'm pretty low rank. I don't know what they would if they sided with Al Qaeda. I maybe some arms I think got out. I think there was an article, wasn't it, that they gave the Obama administration. They basically funded a couple of. I think it was like an Al Qaeda branch of it, and that preceded ISIS, I believe, who came along later. But I think they did get U.S. arms. I think the term they used was like a moderate Al Qaeda. I can't remember the exact term, but I think it was like Susan Rice or somebody made like it was like the moderate Islamic rebels or something. It was something kind of wild, but I do recall that. But like big decisions, no, I have no idea.
What do you think people need to know about the new Cold War with Russia?
My personal view is I think it's good that Trump is going to talk and work with Russia itself, uh, talk to Putin, and anytime you have communication, you're lessening the risk of war. I mean, I don't think Biden and them are even discussing anything. Um, I do think if you turn the temperature down, I do think the war in Ukraine will end soon, just because Trump's also coming in office and the amount of manpower. I mean, I'm sure Russia wants to retool in Ukraine, so they're not going to have a country if they just keep fighting at the rate they are. Their manpower's got to be crushed. But no, I don't see much change happening. It'll probably just still be trading with NATO countries. I think Trump will pressure NATO into increasing his spending. I do think a new Cold War would be extremely bad, though, too. Uh, Especially, Russia feels threatened. We don't know what comes next after Putin. Um, he's pretty not. He is a rational actor, and just to act, you know, trying to overthrow the second world's nuclear power, hoping for an overthrow is or an unstable country is not, smart in my opinion. I know
It
that's
is.
kind of rambling.
It is beyond psychotic that they would even think about something like regime change in Russia, or the constant vilification of Putin, or the fact that Jake Sullivan or Antony Blinken haven't even reached out to either Lavrov or Putin. It is just unbelievable. I never would have guessed that they would go, what, 2 years? I think December of 21 is the last time Biden and Putin spoke. Biden's wearing that stupid mask when he's on webcam talking to Putin. It's just so pathetic. Um, All right, let's talk about tariffs. Do you think tariffs are something that should be embraced by Americans for the purpose of preserving domestic jobs?
I grew up in kind of the Rust Belt, so I am sympathetic to them. And Republicans do have a history of using them. If you look at Reagan, um, I mean, it depends on what and how you use them. I think you can be strategic with it. I mean, I don't think it's good to, have a country that maybe doesn't like us, like China, have, such a large control of our trade. Uh, but I mean, I mean, at least in my opinion, I mean, you have to be strategic about it. The American consumers aren't going to tolerate, too much, price hikes as we just saw with this election. So,
When you say China doesn't like us, out of the 1.2 billion Chinese, how many do you think really don't like us?
uh, I know they're more patriotic. The younger generation is more patriotic. I have seen studies on that. I don't think they hate us. I think they see us as a rival. I do think they do want to undercut us militarily. I do think that. I don't think that they want to surpass us. I don't think that they, want to, destroy the.
Oh, I'm sorry, you had cut out there. It'll all mesh together. When it
Okay.
comes to the U.S. China relations, I just don't see why it is so bad. If the U.S. is giving them dollars that every year are losing their value because the Federal Reserve keeps increasing the money supply, the government keeps spending more money, we're sending them dollars. They're sending us actual
Yeah.
products and services. It seems like the US is winning on this side of the deal. Millions of people in lower and middle class have middle incomes. They have access to products that our parents never could have imagined having. This increases our standard of living, and we're sending them Federal Reserve notes, which we are constantly admitting that, oh, those are gonna be eventually worthless. It seems like, one, we shouldn't vilify billions of people and provoke another war, even if it means potential regime change in Taiwan or anything. But more importantly, it seems like we're at the benefiting end of this. Is there something I'm missing?
No, I do see your point, and I think Ron Paul made a point just like that. To be honest. No, I agree. I don't think we should vilify China. I do get sick reading some of the comments that talk about Russians and their culture you see on X as well. I think the point I would make is that you talk about a higher standard of living, and I agree our GDP has gone up, but I mean, look at would you say people are happier? I know that's kind of a cop out, but do you think maybe Americans having an extra TV, is it worth like the not job security, the lower fertility rates? I feel like that does play a role into it when you lose manufacturing jobs. I mean, would having an extra TV or fridge in your house lead to it? Um, Granted, our standard of living is much higher than the 70s, but I mean, mental health rates, fertility rates, people aren't buying starter homes. I know that isn't all tied into trade, but I do feel like there's some correlation. Maybe we have sold out, and I think Buchanan has talked about that as well in trade wars. But I would love to hear your response. I know I can't prove the rise of GDP has. That would be dumb to say. I know I can't prove that the trade wars that hollowed out manufacture or not trade wars, but the free trade kind of hollowed out the industrial base led to this stuff. But maybe there's some correlation if you understand what I'm saying.
Sure. There's definitely jobs that are changing. In, I think, 1800, 80% of people were employed in America in the agricultural industry. Now it's only 2%. So jobs can definitely change. I think people are less happy in general today. I think that's as a causal result of losing religion and not finding something fulfilling to replace it with. I don't think it's because they have more access to products and services. I think the previous generation saw happiness as the result of frequent positive social interactions with other people. Today, people see happiness as acquiring more material goods, and that is totally terrible. That is something I'm on board with. I just don't think
Okay, I agree
tariffs
there.
would be a solution to that. But when it comes to job security, I think the best way to not be insecure is to have a lot of options. Because when I originally had a job, I was terrified. I was walking on eggshells, terrified to quit. Once I gained a lot of on the job skills and the area I live in, Chandler, Gilbert, and Mesa, Arizona, started to expand and have more businesses, I had no problem being a little more stern with my boss. I was happy to ask for a raise, knowing if he didn't give it to me, I could apply somewhere else. So I think job security would come from having more job opportunities for the average person. And that could result from massive deregulation, as we've seen since the 60s and 70s. The code of the Federal Register pages, the number of regulations has
I've seen that.
absolutely skyrocketed, even though there was a small drop under Reagan and small under Trump. It's not even close. The net gain in regulations. This increases compliance costs for all businesses, but Amazon and Walmart are not terrified of going out of business if the minimum wage is increased or if there's another regulation. It's small businesses which get canned out. So this means employees have fewer options than they otherwise would in a less regulated environment, and they're more insecure on the job. And because there's fewer opportunities, employers don't have to work so hard to attract good talent by offering more money to employees. So I definitely see the loss of jobs as something terrible. I don't think it's because there's too many voluntary exchanges. I think it's because there's too much third party coercion by people in Washington, D.C. and state governments as well. Anytime I see, like, if you take the big examples, a blockade on Yemen, a blockade on Gaza, Churchill's blockade of Germany in the First World War, these places ended up having mass starvation because they couldn't trade as much. So when you don't trade food, starvation is clear. But when you don't trade technology, it seems like it's less clear, but you're also impoverishing your domestic population. That is my final justification for opposing tariffs and domestic imperialism of a regulatory state. Anything else on tariffs before we move on?
Uh, no, I mean I agree with you, especially on the regulation. I'll agree with you there, just because I agree with the choices. So this my home state, once the jobs went away, it's kind of a bluish state. Everybody was leaving for the not red states, but the states with like easier to start businesses. Ohio was a big one people are moving to just because it's easier to start businesses. They had more options. So I definitely see that. I had family members actually leave. So I do agree with regulation cutting it. So I definitely see your point there.
Who is your favorite president ever and why?
I use so favorite president ever. I kind of consider who's the best. It's gonna seem a cop out. It, I would say Washington, just because he set the tone and culture. Because if you look at other countries that became free during the revolution around this time period, America could have easily backslided. Shays Rebellion, all that. Um, Washington has kind of set the tone, which allowed basically smooth transfer of power. He was small. I mean, he kind of just made it all happen in the military aspect. I mean, he was the ultimate underdog. So it's a corny answer, but I would say Washington. Modern, I would probably say Reagan, just because he basically got away from LBJ's massive government, or at least tried to. So
Yes, um, that is another point for Reagan, which I should have considered. I would say my favorite president, after having read RN, the Nixon Memoirs. It's 1,000 pages of his entire life. Reading that, I'm tempted between either Nixon or Eisenhower. I might say Eisenhower. When he invited Nikita Khrushchev to tour America, this was the Butcher of Budapest. In
Right.
1956, he was given that title. And in 1959, he was willing to shake hands without conceding really anything. He basically drew red lines saying,
Ended the
until we
Crimean
have
War.
exactly. He was able to draw red lines that were much more reasonable. He said, "You can't have any bases in Guatemala. We will go to war over this. But until we give West Germany a war guarantee, we're not going to do it unless 10 other countries get on board." I saw him as much more caring about peace. This is why, are you pro life?
I am, yes.
Yes, me too. So I definitely believe that the fetus is differentiated from property in the property person's dialectic. The fetus is a human life. I also think we should extend that pro life position to people in our own country and other countries as well. So I see Eisenhower and his anti war stance as practicing real world pro life diplomacy. So that is my reasoning for liking Eisenhower the most. Especially, there's a chapter in his second book. I think it's titled "Waging Peace." Is the book where he talks about his reasoning for his discussions with the Soviets, and it really, really makes you appreciate this guy.
He did hate war. That is, I mean, that is true. He was very different from MacArthur. I know I keep bringing it up, but Ron Paul, I think, uses the same argument for being pro-life as well and extending it to war. So that is, I will give the libertarians that. I will give that.
Who was the worst president ever, and why?
Worst president ever. Um, I mean, it is a hard question. I say worst modern president would probably be LBJ, Medicare or Medicaid, the expansion of it. Civil rights law, it was good, what it happened, but how he weaponized it, basically, now it controls every part, not every part, but basically, it hammers every business, no matter what, disparate. And then Vietnam too. I mean, he essentially did it. I mean, it's more complex than he relates, but he basically did it not to seem weak against Goldwater on communism. I wouldn't say that was the only reason, but I mean that was a huge part. And then to extend the war, yeah, he probably would be the worst modern president overall. I would have to think about it. Maybe, yeah, I'd say LBJ probably just because he's impacted our country the most at this time.
I think the case for LBJ is very good, that he might be the worst. I would just have to go with Woodrow Wilson getting involved in the First World War on with the American involvement. People forget that this led to 116,000 American deaths, led to military conscription of men. I want to say ages 18 to 41 was the original um, range that he used for conscription. He had the Espionage Act, putting people in jail for speaking out against the war.
Dobbs, yeah,
Um, he had the creation of the Federal Reserve monopolizing the currency, which the biggest thing is it outlaws potential competing currencies. So it doesn't keep the Fed on their toes. Even if there's no other major currency, the fact that there could be a potential one, I think, would stop them from constantly inflating. He also solidified the income tax. So I would have to say Woodrow Wilson is my least favorite for those reasons. When it comes
okay.
to, yeah,
No, I was gonna say, I know you said you're a Nixon fan. I was always curious. I've heard different things from, I know libertarians. The gold standard. How did you feel about that, or what's your take on that? Because I mean, Nixon was also a peace candidate as well. Um, so what's your take on his price control? Because economics, he was more of a, I guess, big government Republican, or the before Reagan Revolution Republican. So I was interested in your thoughts on that.
It seems very clear that the price controls led to shortages in the economy. This is something
Inflation.
Nixon even admits in the August 1971 chapter of his memoir. But to this day, he still defends the gold standard. Now, when he talks about why he went off the gold standard, he said the British came to the Americans, the ambassador, and said, "We want these 3 billion Federal Reserve note dollars. We want to exchange this for gold." Nixon's reasoning was if we gave them the gold, it might entice everyone else to come get their gold now. If we don't give them the gold, in response, people might say, well, the US has defaulted and can't pay its debts. So Nixon said that he was stuck in a very difficult situation and decided to close the gold window. He uses the word temporary. It's been 50 years, so I don't think it's temporary. Um, so the original justification for him doing it was not, well, it'll be great for economic growth and it's really good to be able to print money without having a backed currency. His original justification was it would make us look bad. So now when all the Paul Krugmans of the world are saying, oh, what a great thing it is that the Federal Reserve can print money at will and has a monopoly on this, that was never the original justification for why Nixon got us off of it. I think it was a mistake in the long run. He says getting off the gold standard was on net a good thing. I think having a commodity based currency is a great check and balance when it comes to governments. It's good to have the Supreme Court. It's good to have, a population that can resist something. It's good to have the Second Amendment as a check and balance. But the concept that you can't spend too much without affecting the price of a commodity. It's one check and balance to stop the government from constantly overspending. The more resources that the government spends money on, the less resources there are available for the voluntary sector, which I see as the great civilized wealth creator within society. So I would certainly oppose that. And the more dollars that are easily printed when you don't have a gold standard means people
Right.
who save their money basically lose the value drastically. A lot of save, so it creates a disincentive for people to save. So if they're not going to save up to buy a house, well, then they engage in low impulse control behaviors and they're more likely to go to strip clubs, more likely to buy drugs to deal with their lot in life. I mean, so few people in my generation are actively saving up for a house. So all of this is certainly connected to a very weak currency. So I would still like Nixon a lot, but that I think was definitely the wrong move.
I liked your point about low impulse control. Very rarely hear that argument over why people have. I mean, that doesn't. People don't really talk about it. I think Vic Ramachan did actually talk about it, so uh, as well. So it is nice to hear that argument from a libertarian point of view.
What is your most important issue?
Most important issue. Most important issue would be just preserving the culture of the U.S. So when I say culture, the U.S. immigration plays a role. All these different things play a role, but for me, we are a free, enterprising country. I know I disagreed with you on how much the government should tip the scales, but just the entrepreneurship, the suspicion of small government as well. To me, those are the biggest things. And you saw with when Obama, Clinton as well, um, but Obama seemed to be the one that really kind of stepped it up to that next level of being not individualism, but more, he'd always say the word community and just basically individualism. Even for every group that's come here, they've always, it was less about political power, more about uh, wealth generation. Look at the Italians, the Jewish, uh, blacks. A big thing was Motown. Culture. They wanted to build wealth, and then having the culture shift to, a more community based, more big government, more, inner life it's more the mindset to me that we lose kind of our independent streak and kind of rely more on the nanny state. And so that's my biggest fear, that we end up like a Britain, or we end up like a one of the European countries that are just stagnant, at least to me, or Spain even. So at least to me, all the other issues kind of come from that. Abortion, that is something that we do have to win the minds on. But they have been making progress. But that to me was the biggest win, is the rejection of kind of the nanny state, what we saw this last election.
Excellent points. Now I can really see why LBJ, it makes sense, is
Yes,
your least favorite.
the great.
Anything else?
Oh, I'm
The
sorry.
greats is, my gosh, how
Uh,
annoying is that? It's up there with the Patriot Act. It's like, oh
oh
my,
yeah.
how can you give them these names? Anything else you want to discuss?
No, that's pretty much it. If you're interested in the Great Society book, I forget who wrote it, but it was like the history of it. I think it's Anthony Shells. I can't remember her name. She wrote the FDR book as well, The Forgotten Man.
Amity
Emily
Schlaze, I think is her
Slays.
name.
Yeah,
Yeah, she,
there's a great book on the Great Society. At one point, one of the programs were basically giving money to rioters that were organizing riots in the inner city. So at one point, the government was handing them money, and they would, so it is a quite of a wild ride. Um, so, um, but that's figured you enjoy that book.
yeah, Great Society, A New History by Amity Schlaze, I think is
I know
how
I
you say it.
butchered her name.
I did read a book she wrote titled The Forgotten Man.
Yeah, FDR.
Um,
Yeah, 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 the Great
and that was
Depression.
on FDR. I have not even heard of this book. So that is very interesting. I will check that out. Now, your favorite Pat Buchanan book, I would have to say Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. I thought was such an excellent book. Do you have a favorite Buchanan book?
Uh, Death of the West, I would say, just because all the problems he addressed, they were kind of uh he called it like 25 years ahead of time. So I'd say Death of the West. I've read Death to Super. I've read the Churchill. I don't agree with it. Um, I do. So I do see the points he makes. I don't agree with that. Uh, but he is. He basically makes the strongest arguments for that point of view. So I will give him that. Death of the West, where the right went wrong. Death of the Superpower, I think, was decent. So those three.
Yeah, the title was Suicide of a Superpower. Can America Survive to 2025 is the actual title. So we will see. We will see. Thanks to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute on X. John, thank you for your time, brother.
I appreciate it. Thank you for